Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today for this special press conference. During this event, a statement will be read by the Chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee, Professor Eliza Calder. The statement draws on the data and analysis produced by the MVO, which was discussed recently at the 27th meeting of the Scientific Advisory Committee held this week. Immediately following this, I will open the floor where the press will be allowed to ask questions. In the interest of time, questions will be limited to 2 per media organization. The purpose of this conference is to discuss the activity of the volcano, and questions will need to be tailored to this. Organizations will be called by myself when it is time for them to speak. We will begin with the members of the SAC introducing themselves, after which Professor Calder will read the preliminary statement.
Hi, I'm Eliza Calder, a professor of volcanology at the University of Edinburgh.
My name is Mike Burton. I'm a professor of volcanology at the University of Manchester in the UK.
My name is, excuse me, my name is Jürgen Neuberg, and I'm a professor in geophysics at the University of Leeds in the UK.
Hi, I'm Graham Ryan, and I'm the director of the Montserrat Volcano Observatory.
Okay. The Montserrat Volcano Observatory reports that the Sulphur Hills volcano has produced higher rates of degassing and volcanotectonic earthquakes since around 2019, and that these have been sustained over the last 12 months. The longer-term trend of inflation of the island has continued at the same rate as in previous years. Measured SO2 fluxes have averaged 400 tonnes per day over the last 12 months. An average of 9 volcanotectonic earthquakes per week have been observed. Thermal camera images of fumaroles on the dome indicate that the temperatures of fumaroles is similar to previous years, with maximum temperatures of 545 degrees centigrade. Monitoring of ground deformation indicates a slow but continuous lengthening over the island and a maximum uplift of about 1 centimetre over the last year. This deformation trend is consistent with that observed over the previous 12 months. Taking these observations together, we conclude that the volcano remains in a state of unrest. The best explanation for this unrest is the continued supply of magma and gas from depth to a magmatic reservoir. Thus, the resumption of lava extrusion or explosions remain a possibility in the future. However, we consider that the most likely scenario for the next year is a continuation of the current state. The volcano, with its large lava dome, is still potentially a source of hazard within Zone V, including explosions, pyroclastic flows, and lahars. The chance that explosions or pyroclastic flows will occur within the next year remains low. Continuous monitoring of the volcano remains essential.
Thank you, Professor Calder. I will now open up the floor for questions from the press. Reminder that questions will be limited to 2 per media organization. I will begin with the media host to my immediate left.
Thank you very much, Ms. Williams, and good evening to our friends who are here from the Scientific Advisory Committee and to all our colleagues and our technicians. I first want to welcome Professor Calder to the chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee, taking over from Professor Jürgen Neuberg. Welcome as chairperson, Professor Calder.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Okay. Now, my first question is, after going through the report, is based on what we are seeing here in the report, do we still need an exclusion zone? If it's no, if it's yes, maybe you can explain why. And I guess you'll understand why I'm asking this. Do we really still need an exclusion zone? And thinking back, I knew at one time we were talking about microzoning. So I don't know who wants to take that.
I'll take that question. So the volcano is still in this state where we have some background activity, which gives us enough reason to be concerned. It is not a volcano that has gone completely quiet after the end of an eruption. Okay, so over the longer term, we can expect that this volcano might become active again. Do we need an exclusion zone? We still have a very large lava dome up there. The lava dome can collapse and produce pyroclastic flows with little warning. The volcano could also change state and become a little bit more active. So we have to be ready for that potential increase in activity at some point. It is clear that the zone V at the moment is quite a large zone. And I think it would be clear to everybody that not everywhere in zone V has the same level of hazard, right? The zone V includes places that are very close to the volcano, as well as places that are really quite far removed from the volcano. So one of the tasks at the MVO at the moment is to look again at the distribution of hazard within Zone V in order to try to distinguish areas that are relatively lower hazard, and then communicate that to the government of Montserrat and to the Governor's Office and to other groups around Montserrat who will then consider issues related to risk and issues related to accessibility of some of those issues.
Okay, my second question is, and this is based on the fact that, I say we have maybe more than 50 stations around the volcano. And I remember that some time ago, maybe a long time ago, events used to happen and we would hear that they came out of the blue. But then later on, the scientists would go back and look and say, well, it didn't come out of the blue. There were some precursor activities, but we didn't really see them as precursor activities. My question is, with all of the instrumentation on the volcano, can it still happen that we have one of these so-called out-of-the-blue experiences?
Yes, I'd like to take this question. We think it is extremely unlikely, but we can't, on the other hand, completely rule it out, that we have some out-of-the-blue event, meaning we have an event that has no precursors at all. This volcano has switched on and off in the past, and it does it now for more than 20 years. And so we went back and looked carefully what this transition looked like when the volcano went from a pause to a new phase of extrusion. And indeed, we found precursors in each case. They were sometimes different, sometimes subtle, but by identifying even these tiny or subtle precursors, we are now very sure that the Volcano Observatory, with all their equipment, which is maintained here, would be able to detect those. So in one word, it is very unlikely to have something really out of the blue, which would surprise us all. And we are very confident that precursors will be detected.
May I add something to that as well? That, of course, one of the main considerations when we're looking at hazards is the magnitude of any event. And it's really important when we're thinking about things that could happen with very little warning, that the larger the event, the lower the probability that it can occur with no precursory activity. And so, while a minor rockfall may be not having a precursor, it may itself be a precursor to something larger, and so on. So, even though we acknowledge there is a possibility of blue sky events, it becomes very low probability to have a large magnitude event with absolutely no warnings, particularly thanks to the fact that we have the MVO here, which is able to work very effectively and has all the stations that you mentioned continuously monitoring the activity.
Okay, thank you. Malika Mackenzie Weeks, and from the Alugana Express News. What is the comparable heat and stability level of the dome in areas overlooking Brambles Airport compared to when we had our last pyroclastic flow on that direction? Has the heat content and energy levels reduced over time in a way to make it more difficult and unlikely for flows to reach the Brambles Airport? Is there any scenario where a very deep channel can be cleared between the airport and the flow part to provide a safety net for operations of the old runway, which can be easily cleared by sand miners? It has been commented by some that if the strip were cleared and maintained, aircraft operations could resume, especially with passengers offloading on a new taxied closer to the Blake's area, and the plane's engine kept on standby. So the question is there a way that we can clear somewhere between where we had the last flow and the present Brambles Airport for planes to just offload and to move?
I can make a start at addressing that question, and maybe Graham could follow my comments up. So you'll excuse me for being a little bit surprised at the question, because often we discuss the issues that we think come up in Montserrat over the year, where people might want some level of access, and we discuss hazard assessments related to those places, and I haven't heard discussion about airport. This is the first time for me, anyway. One of the issues, I think, that there are places within Zone V that are relatively safe in comparison to other places. We have to put that information together with the fact that the dome is relatively quiet now, but over the longer term, we can expect that this volcano does not stay quiet. That means that if you're going to consider accessibility or uses of some parts of Zone V, then it's more appropriate to consider uses that have short-term benefits. But I think because of the reasonably high chance that over a long period of time the volcano will become more active again, that means it is not, it's not appropriate to consider uses within Zone V that have longer term implications or involve longer term infrastructure, things like that, because over the long term, the most likely scenario is that the volcano does become active. That means that some uses within Zone V are perhaps more relevant to have on the table, and other uses of Zone V are perhaps less wise to be discussing. And in my mind, some considerations about kind of long-term infrastructure, such as an airport operation, is something that may be, more appropriate to a place where, over the long term, you could be satisfied that the volcano is going to give you that chance. In this case, the volcano might give us shorter-term windows to do things in some parts of Zone V. I'm not convinced that something like the airport would fall into that category. I did.
Good. Well, I think Eliza answered that question quite adequately. It's out of scope of the questions. I think that the questions are supposed to be really about the volcanic activity, and we can answer the first part of the question in that the dome has been cooling down. Most of the fumaroles have dropped in temperature, but we've noted there's one fumarole in particular which we started monitoring those temperatures during this pause in 2013, and it started off in the 600-degree range, and then between 2017 and so on, it went down into the 300s, and then over the last few years, that temperature's gone up to like 550. So like the temperatures went down and then came up for this particular fumarole. So again, that's another kind of piece of evidence. We talked about the volcanotectonic earthquakes and the gas, and those are mentioned in the report. But also this temperature increase, also again, just is the volcano reminding us that it's still there, the system is still dynamic and still has capability. So that's the kind of first part of the question. The second part, I think Eliza answered pretty well. I said, like the role of the MVO is to give advice on the risks and hazards posed by the volcano to the authorities, and then they're the ones that make the decisions about, you know, what should be done and what shouldn't be done. So there's a clear kind of line of where the kind of responsibilities are, which is kind of why that we can't really answer that question. But Eliza gave some very broad context as to kind of, you know, how reasonable that might be.
So my second question, however, would have been fitting if we had maybe a government person here to talk. So
Okay. Yes, indeed. Maybe something we could think about in future.
Good afternoon, James White from Radio Montserrat. And I was listening to the science as it pertained to the volcano on my way here. And I'm asking, with the current state of the volcano, what is the situation as it stands now with access into Zone V?
Okay, so like the Zone V access.
And include for sand miners as well.
Yeah. So I mean, the currently laws and regulations around access to Zone V. So Zone V is an area that can only be entered with specific permission from the DMCA. So the DMCA, if somebody wishes to enter Zone V, they would seek permission from the DMCA, and then DMCA would evaluate that request and either grant or not grant access. And so within Zone V, there are certain designated activities which have been ongoing and are ongoing. For example, tourism activity in the Plymouth area, and as you mentioned, the sand mining. So the sand mining originally was not occurring in Zone V, and then they sought permission to extend their operations. And because that was outside, the authorities required a process to determine whether or not that was feasible, and part of that was a risk assessment that was done by the MVO. So that was one part of the process to give the government some of the information they needed as to whether or not to allow those particular activities in Zone V. So now the sand miners have been given permission to operate in the upper Bellum, and every day they will get So they have permissions, but before they go in, they would contact the MVO. So everybody who's operating in Zone V legitimately would be in contact with the MVO so that we could give them a quick warning if anything should happen. So that's kind of one of the differences between being inside and outside of Zone V. You need that extra level of kind of awareness and safety cover when you're in Zone V, and so that's what the kind of MVO provides in that situation.
Professor Neuberg, you would have alluded to the fact that you're not expecting, or more or less the same, for the next year. How does this play into what is expected in terms of activities in that particular area, in Zone V?
Well, after having seen the data MVO is collecting, we came to the conclusion that the most likely scenario is that for the next year, it will stay as it is. Now, you look mostly at the dome, because this is what you can see. But what the MVO with their instruments also sees is tiny, or for a volcano, classical earthquakes that you cannot feel. But these earthquakes tell us that the whole system is still in a stage of unrest. With their GPS network, the MVO can monitor that the whole island of Montserrat is still expanding. And we went through several models and tried several explanations, and for us, still the most plausible is that magma is trickling into a reservoir. And also that gives us an indication that the whole system is still active. And I think this is what you take into account in order to judge if the whole volcano is safe, or is it dying, is it going dormant, and this one isn't just yet.
Yes, am I allowed a third question? Two? Okay, so it's just a follow-up, an exception, please.
Nobody else.
So, just listening to your explanation, Professor Neuberg, what would we be looking for so as to say that the volcano is nearing the end of its activity? It's a recurring question, you know, and I just want to put it there again so that you can give an explanation.
So let's put it this way. If suddenly, for example, the gas output would stop, that would rather worry us, okay? Because the system could be blocked and could actually get some more pressure. If the deformation would suddenly just tail off, also that, when you look at the records, this happened as soon as the magma starts rising again, and therefore the reservoir would deflate. So also that isn't really good news. However, and we have these three criteria, deformation, in which direction ever. If we have still deformation, it means the eruption isn't over. Gas should be basically, yeah, as I said, is an ambivalent, but my colleague will talk to that. I think the most reliable indicator is the seismicity. And if seismicity dies really down, then that would be a clear indication that we are approaching the end of the episode. But gas is a bit tricky. Mike, maybe you can tell something about this.
I wouldn't necessarily use the word tricky, but it's certainly the case that in an eruption which has a discrete lifetime, the normal thing you'd expect is that at the end of the activity, the gas emission would trail down to a background level of, for SO2, that would be 0. And SO2 is the main gas that we are measuring, that the MVO is measuring here on Montserrat. And instead, as we see in the statement that has been released today, the average for the last few months has been 400 tonnes per day. Now, 400 tonnes per day is a lot. It's a very chunky gas emission. And that's really not what you'd expect to see in a volcano which has no magma supply. And the thing that concerns us really is there a potential for eruptible magma to be present within the system? Is there the potential for pressurization within a magma reservoir to reach a point where a resumption of activity could occur? We're not saying it is about to occur, but what we see is the presence of the gas and the presence of the inflation indicate the possibility of a resumption of activity in the future remains high. But in the short term, there isn't any sign of any immediate precursors to any to a resumption. So we're in this slightly twilight zone where we feel that any activity is unlikely to occur. But in the long term, going back to the question from your colleague, you would be looking very carefully about doing anything long-term infrastructure around the volcano at the moment, because the highest probability is eventually a resumption of activity. And I know that is really not a fantastic kind of piece of information for the residents of Montserrat, because everyone wants to go back to the way things were. But we have to follow the science, and this is what the science is telling us.
We've now come to the end of the press conference. Thank you everyone for joining us. Do enjoy the rest of your day.